Well, howdy doody once again. Here we are with the final readings from William Heat Moon. It's been a very good series of books. I've certainly enjoyed reading them, and I hope you've enjoyed the excerpts that I've read to you from them. This final reading is from his book Prarie Erth, where he's spent a long time in Elk County, right slap bang in the middle of America, in Kansas. He's looked around there and he's found interesting things to do with natural history, geological history, and of course social history. In this last reading's a pretty amazing piece of social history. As you probably know, those central states were settled fairly early on, but it was tough. It was very hard. In the 1930s, of course, it got so tough a lot of people walked off, and before then, in the century before that, there were also droughts and hurricanes and tornadoes, floods, that made life very difficult as well. So in this chapter entitled Elk, William Heat Moon is looking at the local graveyard, and he's looking at the names on the stones, all Europeans, of course, looking at the names on the stones and looking at how long they lived, the causes of death, and putting together some stories in his own mind. And then he finds a stone which is pretty well indecipherable, and he thinks about that quite a bit. And then he realizes that this stone's kind of the memorial stone to not the unknown soldier, but the unknown settlers. And so what he does is he writes a composite story about a man and a woman who come to this area from different parts of America, marry, have children, and then pass on. So this is quite an unusual form of writing, so bear with me. So what he starts out with, and he says he, and then he talks about the man, and then he says she, and he talks about the woman, and they're composite. So when he talks about he doing things, it can be 5 or 6 different men, and she similarly 5 or 6 different women, their experiences. Okay, so here we go, page 433. He came into the county from New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois in 1859, 1860, 1865. Rode with John Brown, took a mini ball at Pea Ridge, and got captured at Chickamauga and sent to Libby Prison. Was so crowded in there that the men had to sleep on their sides on the floor, and when the hardness became too much, they would all turn at the same time on a signal from a leader. This is the Civil War, of course. They had to survive Libby by getting food from prisoners too near to death to eat. In 1892, he took the train from Chase to Chicago to see the Columbian Exposition, and, oh God, stunned to turn a corner and find himself again in front of the nightmare, the 3-story brick prison, reconstructed there, and with his wife walked through it, crowded as before, and not much able to believe what was happening. He heard that Lincoln once said, "If I went west, I think I would go to Kansas." And he came into the county with a soldier's warrant for 160 acres. She came into the county in 1858, 1861, 1866, from Ohio or Indiana, Missouri. Her youngest brother, at 16, put creek stones into his boots to make himself tall enough to enlist, but got no further than Fort Leavenworth and died of pneumonia. And a friend took Billy's hat and wore it at a second Manassas. She came with her father by ox team with a brace of coop chickens in the wagon, and the going was slow because of the milch cow tied behind, and the 4 beeves herded along, and nothing so bad as fording creeks in infernal muddy banks, and had to lay tall grass under the wheels, and followed the Santa Fe trail to the Grove and down the old core trail. Whenever he saw an approaching prairie fire, always thought how it looked like a line of battle, and got burned when one jumped the neighbour's guard and took his pole barn. And before that, no rain for 18 months, and the Cottonwood River went dry, and slow grass covered the riverbed, and won't mention who let a fire get loose, and it came right up to the river like a flood. And of course the earthquake, 2 years after the war, and he was laying up a roof beam in the new barn, and the rumbling commencing to shake the timber, and he running to the cabin for her, and she holding onto the wall, and what a racket the furniture was in. She said about the cabin logs, "The gaps was big enough, you could nearly throw a cat through them, and the door was only a hung rag." And she said the wind would come through and blow out the grease lamp, nothing but a saucer of animal fat with a flannel rag twisted on a nail. Sometimes the corps passed by and stopped to look through the gaps, and once, to make friends, she held a mirror up to the gap and scared tarnation out of a painted brave. And then there was laughter like you wouldn't believe, and they took turns gaping into it and admired and chortled, and thereafter, when passing, always stopped to use the mirror. Down on Cedar Creek, the corps came out to see that new Frenchwoman, and the husband saying she was gone, but the pesky redskins waiting around, and he bolted the door and hid her between 2 feather mattresses for 3 days, and took his meals on the bed so he could slip food to her, and she getting up only after dark to answer nature's calls. Walking home one noon with her youngest, and caught in a thunderstorm, and ducked into an encampment, and corps women mocked her drenching, and laughed at her baby, and later had to remind her how she said she'd rather take her chances with Indians than border ruffians. Not she, that woman, complaining about moving on west because there'd already been enough pioneering in Iowa. Later she's saying, "I never complained. I was the one wanting to come west," and proud she never took her children out to hide in some creek bank hole, and she wasn't the woman who heard coyotes howling and then skulked all night in a cold thicket to escape Indian attack. Didn't the children Gracious sakes alive, love the terror of corps visits. Learning after a few years they'd settled on a railroad grant and had to abandon their place and build again. Just another burden to bear, but not so bad as her brother's. He filed on land some miles southwest, but decided it was worthless and gave it up, and 3 years later a town was founded on his own claim, called Wichita. She was homesick much of the time until he met her. She once walked back to Illinois to see the folks, and when the food ran out, their first spring together, went on foot to Fort Leavenworth, 150 miles, and back, with a bag of flour on his shoulder, and hoping it wouldn't rain, and had to split rails for a month to earn 8 bushels of wheat. Walked in the house one evening, and land o' Goshen, if there wasn't a big old rat snake unwinding out of the canary cage, and no canary. She told him for the last time to get a door up. The woman near the falls, who was making lye soap in a kettle in front of her house, and 3 corps riding up and motioning they wanted some soup, and she shaking her head and saying, "Soap, not soup," and they growing vexed she wouldn't share, and one grabbing the stir spoon and taking a big slurp, and his eyes reddening and tears welling up, but without a word, he passing the spoon to the next, and he tasting and giving the spoon to the third, and he likewise, then handing her the spoon, and they riding off, and that was the only time anybody could remember a corps crying without wailing. Got good at taking perch and bass and bullheads out of the creek holes, and couldn't afford a gun for the oldest boy, and taught him to make bird traps and figure 8 deadfalls. Those first years, they ate side meat squirrel, buffalo, salted prairie chicken breasts, quail, turkey, biscuits, cornbread, vinegar and sheep sorrel pie, wild plums and grapes, gooseberries, never any coffee, and instead brewed parched corn, and the only condiment vinegar sauce, and the only sweetening sorghum molasses. And she said, "Never saw sugar after I came out to Kansas." Every dry year the grasshoppers came, and the worst was in 74. They ate up his crops and turned around and spit them on him. And he walked in the door and said, "Ain't never swore in front of you before, but I'm going to now." And he sure did. And where her beets and turnips and parsnips grew were just holes in the ground. It's the end of this reading. I'll keep them a bit shorter so they're a bit more bearable. Part 2 is about the same length. That'll be posted next. Look forward to talking to you again soon. Love to you and love to everybody. Good night now.